Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Glad you can join us on what is a sunny day here in Detroit. So we're all happy about that. Um, this is our last session of our Understanding Real Estate Development. It's been a 4-part series over the past couple months. It's been great, and so we're really excited to have you with us. We're seeing a lot of familiar faces, so it's good to see, the people that have been with us, over multiple sessions, perhaps over the whole course of things. David Palmer, got to give it out, a shout out to you for doing that. Bishop Russell, likewise. So today is a little bit different than the previous 3 sessions. So today, we are bringing back our previous speakers, and we're going to be going over basically everything that we've discussed over the past 3 sessions, and probing a little bit deeper into some questions that have emerged since then, and having kind of a real back and forth dialogue about equitable development and how do we encourage that. So before diving into all of that fun stuff, I quickly want to give my colleagues here at D4 a quick chance to introduce themselves. So if you don't know me, my name is Sam Butler and I am with D4, and I'll kick it off to Francis and Samantha to introduce themselves.
Hey everybody, nice to see you again, and thanks for joining us during these 4 sessions. Really grateful that we've had such great conversations, and thanks to the presenters as well for giving their time. My name is Francis Gruno. I'm the Director of Policy, Education, and Research at D4, and yeah, thanks again to Sam and Samantha for helping with this.
Great.
Hi, I'm Samantha. I'm D4's intern, and probably most of you already know, but for those of you who don't, I'm tech support. So if you need any help with anything, you can message me in the chat, or I'll send my phone number in the chat and you can call.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Francis and Samantha. And I do have to say that, this whole series would not be possible without you guys. So we really appreciate it. All right, so here's a quick preview of what's going to happen today. So in a moment, I'm going to kick it off to Francis, who's going to provide some tips on Zoom, some just general housekeeping notes, and then we're going to dive into some previously identified questions about each session. So there's for each previous session, and there were 3 of them, just to remind you, we have a couple questions that have emerged from audience comments after the fact, as well as just internal questions, during D4. So we're going to have the panelists kind of like, go over these questions, give their perspectives. And then after that, we're going to open up to just general Q&A. So if you're in the audience, start thinking about your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. But also when we open it up, feel free to, just take yourself off mute and chime in. We really want to hear from you. We've intentionally kept the audience a little smaller because we want these to be real intimate conversations with back and forth. And yeah, and then, after the Q&A, we're going to give each speaker a chance for any, final comments or closing thoughts. So if that all sounds good, I'll kick it off to Francis with some Zoom tips and housekeeping.
Thanks, Sam. So I'll go through these slides really quickly, especially since we're all Zoom champions by this point in the year. But just to remind you, keep yourself muted so that background noise doesn't interfere with the conversation, but remember to take yourself off mute because we do want to hear from you. That button is in the bottom left. Same with the video. If it's possible, we'd love to see your face, but we understand that might not always be possible. That button is also in the bottom left. You can change your display name by hovering over your name. If you're not Francis Bruno today, make sure that you have your appropriate name up there. Customize your view settings. You can do that in the top right, so you can see the presenter view or the different tiles that Zoom provides. And we want to hear from you, as Sam mentioned, so react. You can use the buttons or raise your hand. And in terms of the meeting and this session, we've tried to make all of these as interactive as we can be, and as Zoom as possible, it makes it possible to do. So you can raise your hand. We'll keep tabs on that through the participant window. You can raise your hand on the telephone by pressing *9. That will show up on your box. And then if you can't use a mouse, you can click on your keyboard, Alt-Y for Windows and Option-Y for Apple. And then use the chat feature. That's been quite robust in terms of asking questions or putting questions in the queue. And you can just pop that window up. I can see that as well as everybody else in terms of asking your question. And it looks like people are already sharing contact information, so that's great. Oops, and sorry about that. And then in terms of signing in, it's just a good way for us to keep records. So do try to make sure that your name is what you would like it to be in the video feed. And if you're called upon, we know most of us here have already been on this, but if you're new, definitely announce yourself and your organization, just so other people know who's on the call. And with that, I think we'll go back to Sam to introduce this session.
Great. Thanks, Francis. Yeah, and I totally echo what you just said about, if people wish, please feel free to share your contact information in the chat. We definitely want people to be able to make connections, offline, and this is part of the reason why we're doing this as well. I should also mention, and I think Francis also mentioned this, that these sessions are being recorded. We do intend to publish these online afterwards. So while we want these to be intimate conversations, we want to be able to, share the information widely. If you have any concerns about this being recorded, please feel free to contact Francis or me after the fact. Great. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our illustrious panel of speakers. And I really, on a personal note, have to thank all of you guys for making the time, both today and during the previous sessions. You've been fantastic. And to our audience, I'll just say, these honestly are some of the brightest and innovative and most knowledgeable minds about the Detroit real estate market. So happy to have them all with us. Our first presenter was Tanya Stapleton, if you recall. So Tanya is a zoning and land use expert with over 20 years of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, most recently serving as the zoning administrator for the city of Detroit. Tanya was featured in our first session, Detroit Zoning and Approval Processes, where she talked about how different development projects often require different paths through Detroit's various departments, agencies, commissions, and boards to gain approval. So, Detroit's development approval process can be labyrinthine, and Tanya is the person with the compass. She knows how to get through it all. We also have Richard Hosey with us. Richard is a Detroit native and a resident and owner of Hosey Development LLC. His completed projects include Kirby Center Lofts, Detroit Savings Bank Lofts, Capitol Park Lofts, and Farwell Lofts in Detroit. Before pursuing development full-time, Richard was a senior vice president at the Bank of America. And Richard has co-presented with Corey Leon for the second session, Where Does Development Happen and Why? Where he highlighted the basic idea that development is essentially a math problem, and that financing projects leaves developers very little wiggle room in markets like Detroit. We also have Corey Leon with us. Corey joined the National Development Council, NDC, in 2011. As field director, Corey works with municipal and nonprofit clients to analyze, underwrite, and structure community development projects, including affordable housing, mixed-use developments, market rate developments, and special use projects. Corey co-presented with Richard for our second session, and Corey was able to boil down the idea to one word: risk. And walked participants through a chart that showed how different rents, including rents below market rate, can affect whether a project is feasible or not. I also want to give a shout out to our speaker, Jennifer Canalos. Jennifer is the Director of Board Administration at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, otherwise known as DEGC. The DEGC is a private nonprofit corporation established in 1978, devoted exclusively to supporting Detroit's economic development initiatives. Jennifer co-presented session 3 with David Schoen, Understanding Development Initiatives, and spoke about how various development projects administered by the state, including brownfields and TIFs, are key tools that developers can use to make projects feasible in cities like Detroit. And last, but certainly not least, we have David Schoen. And David is the chair of his firm's historic rehabilitation tax credit team at Nixon Peabody. He represents diverse clients from institutional investors and mission-driven lenders to for-profit developers and nonprofit project sponsors. David co-presented session 3 with Jennifer and gave an overview of the Federal Historic Tax Program, which is used extensively in Detroit, and believes it's an important tool for future investment since Detroit has so much historic fabric that can be repurposed. So I know you will all join me in just clapping for our presenters. Thank you so much, guys. So with that, let's dive in to the first set of questions. So because we are, because there's some scheduling issues this morning with Tanya, who I don't think, is Tanya still in the car? Probably, okay.
I'm here.
Okay, all right. No problem, Tanya. We're gonna.
I want to apologize to those who have joined us. I was scheduled to pick my son up from college on Friday and it got moved up. So we're headed to Illinois, but I'm 100% here. I'm not driving. I'm in the back seat.
That's good.
So everybody's safe, but I'm 100% with you. And if you would like to take the questions in any order, I think I'm ready. I have a good cell phone signal right now. So.
Well, if it's easy, I mean, we're happy to start with session 2, right? Like if that's better, sure. So session 2, we talked a lot about managing risk and how developers look at development as, a math problem and how that math problem has real impact for Detroit communities. So we also talked about, how developers interact with communities a lot. So one of the questions we kind of wanted to throw out to all of our panelists, because you all work with developers directly, is, how can we do a better job at managing community expectations? How do we foster better communication and relationships with developers and neighborhood stakeholders? So this is essentially a question about engagement. What do you guys think?
So I think that preparing the field beforehand is really important. I think in our presentation we talked a lot about risk, and the risk is the uncertainty. So when you just say, "Hey, neighborhood, come together. There's a developer. Let them know what you're thinking." then that provides a lot of uncertainty. Whereas neighborhoods where you go in and say, there will be developers coming, let's talk beforehand about what this neighborhood wants. Let's organize our thoughts. Let's lay out our parameters beforehand. Then you can actually present those to developers. And then their first interaction is, this is how I'm complying with the prescripted desires of this neighborhood, and this is where I may need some variance, and to have a discussion from these prescripted requirements of the neighborhood. And it takes a lot of the uncertainty out for the neighborhood and for the developer and encourages better communication.
So Richard, who lays out those parameters, as you put it?
So I think the same groups that would organize after development comes should organize before development comes. So, you know, I think where you have a Midtown Inc., they're doing that. Invest Detroit's doing it over in 6 Mile. You know, Jefferson East is doing it along that Jefferson corridor. But you'll see where smaller neighborhood groups, you know, whether it's the block club or whoever, can come together and really start organizing thoughts beforehand. I think it's easier to achieve now because people actually expect that at some point development will come to their neighborhood, whereas previously people probably didn't have that expectation.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you've noted, right, I think we see a lot of communities that are actively doing that. I mean, I spent a lot of years working on the Lower East Side Action Plan, right? So that's like the East Side trying to do a community plan to give developers. But on a much smaller scale, we see groups like the West Village Association, and I think we have Voss on the line today. Yep. You know, and they put together a vision and a whole package of what they would want from future development that they're able to, you know, give to developers. So is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, Richard?
I think that's exactly the type of thing, and you know, then connecting that with city officials and so that can be relayed out. That says, hey, this is what our neighborhood wants. You already know what you're going to hear when you get here. You already know what the public comment is going to be, and feel free to distribute this to developers and see which ones connect with our vision and want to be here, and which ones say, oh, that's not for me. Let me go over to this other neighborhood, and I think it facilitates a much better communication.
Yeah, and you know, the way you just phrased it, it sounds so simple that, you know, you just give it to city officials. But I think
each area has a neighborhood,
right.
You know, what do they call it? The Don. And so that person is actually supposed to be a direct connection into, you know, HRD, the Housing Revitalization Department, where developers connect, or Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, where they also connect. So they can say, you know, and I've seen it work in terms of some of the RFPs, like in North End. You know, there was a Virginia Park RFP, and they said, you know, this is what we've already talked about. So if you're not drawing within this parameters in your presentation, know that you're going to face a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
It would be nice to see something in sort of the modern era that directs people to all of the stakeholders, all of the organizations for a given geography. You look at a map of the city and hone in on a certain neighborhood or geography, and you can see, here are the block clubs, here are the local development corporations, here are the public officials, you know, here are the larger organizations that are working in this area, so that it's more transparent, and it makes it easier, I think, for neighborhood and resident engagement too, because all you have to do is click on a map and see who's working in that area and how to get in touch with them.
And I would like to piggyback. Oh, I'm sorry, Corey.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
I would like to piggyback with this, and I think, and I know that there are plans for this, and we from DEGC from time to time do this, but I think that educating the, you know, neighborhoods and neighborhood stakeholders on exactly what incentives are and how they work is really important too. I find if we have a public hearing for a brownfield plan or something of that notion, you know, we spend some time talking about, so how does TIF work? But I think that actually, you know, showing up in different areas and actually just doing presentations on how incentives work is important too, so that it's understood prior to a project that's coming in.
I would just like to add that unfortunately some of the communities that need investment the most are not organized, and there might be one or two voices that are speaking for the area that aren't actually, there's not any structure there. Sam, I'm glad that you mentioned LEAP, because the one thing that I will say about the Eastside Community Network is they actually host meetings, do community engagement, send out flyers, on behalf of developers for a fee. And I think that's very important because as developers go into a neighborhood, that first interaction needs to start with relationship building, trust. Developers need to see these organizations as partners and as an asset. And unfortunately, sometimes community groups will come to a developer with this attitude of, what are you going to do for me? And it kind of sets the whole relationship off on the wrong foot. I had an opportunity to do quite a bit of work in Grand Rapids last year, and their structure is such that the planning department directs all the developers to the community organizations. They host the meetings, they send out the invites, they put your details of your project on their website, in their newsletters, and it's a no-brainer. You know exactly that everybody's at the table, and as a developer, who's that community voice that I may be ignoring, because it kind of puts that on the community organization to get everybody at the table, and then they are a real valuable partner in the process. So
Yeah, I would say I do a lot of work in Cincinnati, and Cincinnati has a great network of community organizations. They work very closely with both the planning department and the economic development department. So a developer going in there knows who to talk with, and those organizations meet regularly. Detroit used to have a that sort of network, but it in part takes funding. And so, if you're going to have, especially some of these more distressed neighborhoods, to get everyone together, find a place to meet, have any sort of organization at all, it does take some funding. And I believe that Detroit has pretty much gotten out of the business of funding neighborhood organizations. So I think a strategic approach to that would be would help this situation quite a bit.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Corey, for mentioning that important point of funding, right? Because yeah, small nonprofits, I mean, of course, they need funding if they're going to be hosting those meetings and helping to like bridge that relationship between developers and community members.
And I mean, I won't mention the organization, but there was one organization that I did a project in. This was probably a decade ago, but they got no funding from the city, and frankly, it kind of felt like a shakedown when they came. When we came to them with the project, and we were seeking input, and their response was, "If you want our support, here's the date of our next fundraiser, and how many tables are you buying?" And it's like, that's we need these organizations to have their own funding sources, so they're not in some ways put into that position.
yeah, that's a really good point. I've also seen the situation where an organization refuses to meet with someone because they don't necessarily like them, or they have preconceived notions of who the developer is, and then they come to the public hearing and say they did no community engagement, and yet they weren't given the audience. And so that is really, I mean, talk about eroding trust, right? So Corey, you brought up a really good point about funding, and I think what I saw, the reason why I brought up the Grand Rapids example is because it was more of a fee for service. There was an expectation that the developer join the organization, and the membership fee would be $100 a year for everybody. But then if they wanted them to assist with community engagement, there was a fee, and it was sort of a set adopted fee of $1,000 or whatever, $2,500, depending on the organization. And then that provided them an opportunity to carry out their work. It also, what I've seen, and I know this is the case with LEAP, on the Lower East Side is that they provide jobs to young people that are out flyering the neighborhood and door knocking, canvassing. And so that's just kind of an added benefit that we don't think about sometimes. But I think it's a good investment. Detroit needs to be sort of normalized, so you don't have that shakedown and that all those differences between neighborhoods and organizations and how they approach it.
I mean, is that model from Grand Rapids, Tanya, something that we should try and mimic here in Detroit, where like a developer pays a membership fee, or if there's a fee for service? And is that different than the shakedown? And I will add, like in D4's research, we've seen that in Ann Arbor, developers are required to host a community meeting, and because of that requirement, they often partner with a local community group to co-host that, right? So it's very interesting how like that onus is on the developer as opposed to the city of organizing that meeting.
I think it takes all three parties to have a successful community engagement process. I did notice also on the west side of the state, all of the community meetings were on Facebook Live. So there were, I remember presenting in front of one board, and there was probably 4 people in the room. I think they were all board members, but there was like 48 people like viewing on Facebook Live. And it was such a different environment than what I was used to in working in Detroit. And they, so technology is a thing we hadn't brought up before, but I think community organizations can utilize technology like Facebook Live with a laptop very easily.
Yeah, certainly in the times of COVID, we're all thinking about how do we digitally engage, how do we bridge the digital divide as much as possible? And so, yeah, these are probably questions that we're just gonna have to look at as we talk about community engagement in the future, right? Increasingly so. So I know we can probably talk about community engagement for hours, but I'm really glad this was the first question, out of the gate. But in an effort to move on, I also want to bring up the notion of rehab and home repair. So in our previous, sessions, we talked a lot about Detroit's extensive stock of single and two-family homes. They're continuing to deteriorate at a distressing clip. And, and to some extent that makes it more difficult to actually create more affordable housing. So I guess I sort of want to just throw out a broad question is like, how do we creatively approach rehabbing and repairing our stock of single and two-family homes? And can someone draw that bright line for me between doing that and how that will improve affordable housing?
So I think with the information that Corey went over during our session of the actual cost of providing an affordable unit in a new or gut rehab, and then we talked about the difference in that cost of putting together even a house that looks like it's pretty much gone in a single family or two family, and it's significantly less. I mean, when you look at the Rehab and Ready program that the land bank and the city are doing, and what they're putting in, even to take just a property from 100% AMI down to 60% AMI, that lost value is sometimes twice what it takes to put a house back to being in new condition. So it's the least expensive way to provide affordable housing in the city is to put the single family and two family homes back into use. And it's that concept behind proposal in that even if you put $70,000 into a house and it's appraisal, I don't always like saying value. It's appraisal comes back at 40,000 after you're done, because to provide a home that is 100% rehabbed up to par, desirable for a family, would cost a developer and to put it into a multifamily building, $150,000, you've actually had a gain. And so perfecting that program and expanding it, making it something that's just very standard, that says a home has a value, and an affordable home has a great value to this community as infrastructure. And if we have to spend money on a consistent basis to keep those homes up, then that's what we do, just like we repave the streets.
I think the other thing is that we really need maybe it's a community development financial institution. Maybe we can find a credit union locally that'd be willing to take this on. But we need an entity to do small dollar amount mortgages. Because the other problem is that on that house that eventually is going to sell for maybe $40,000 is whether that person can find a mortgage. It's not that they're not qualified for a mortgage. I mean, the debt service on a $40,000 mortgage is probably somewhere around $250 to $300 a month based on today's interest rates. The problem is finding a mortgage company willing to make that loan. Yeah. Because there's a certain there's just a cost, a transaction cost, to doing a mortgage, and it's simply not profitable for most, when the mortgage companies right now are extremely busy with refinances where they can make a much better margin than, on trying to do a small dollar amount mortgage. So that's one of the things that I think would, aid Proposal N quite a bit.
No, I completely agree. That's a very, very important idea. It's we see models of that in the community development space, where our social lenders are doing small development loans that larger banks wouldn't want to do, because it's just too much overhead for what you're getting, right? And so taking that same model and saying someone has to fund that overhead to get these loans out, because it's an overall community benefit, and separate that out from the profit margin of the actual loan. And so being able to define that and then actually properly fund it. So there's a mortgage assistance programs out there, and they are hugely backed up because they are not properly funded and properly staffed. And so there's this huge demand, but the timeline is so long. And so really think correctly and valuing that and saying, yeah, if it costs an extra $1 million a year to run an efficient mortgage office, then let's fund that separately from the profitability of that loan.
Richard, I wonder if you would speak to the construction side. Obviously, the financing has a whole range of issues, frankly, even to the point of, is everyone best suited to home ownership? Should any of these single or two families be rented to their occupants, or is it best for people to own? That's perhaps a whole other discussion, but I thought you would have some thoughts about, like you were talking about Rehab and Ready and expanding that program. Is that best done where the developers who do them are doing a few at a time, 1, 2, 3s, as opposed to one organization being responsible for a large number of houses? How would you see that scaling up?
So I think if it's one organization responsible, it's imperative that they reach out to sub that out to different developers, even if they're organizing. And I think you'll kind of see that over and over, where what the Rehab Ready program is attempted to do is to do the hardest ones, so that the individual developers will come and start developing around them. Their expectation isn't to do all of them, it's that they will start the area with the ones that people will have the most reserve about, and that will encourage people to come grab all the other ones. And whether it's ones or whether it's 8 at a time or 10 at a time, just kind of priming the pump. And so we just have too many houses to say, okay, this organization will do them all. And it doesn't even lead to, you know, equitable development. But having something that says the hardest houses are infrastructure as opposed to investments. And that gets people over the line such that the easier houses now become viable investments, and you get all this private development. And I think you get the people who want to own, and you get the people who want to own investment property, and provide that to the people who want to rent. It all rolls together.
Do you think we're there already in Fitzgerald or Bagley, or is there a part of the city where you feel like it's gotten to that point yet?
So Bagley absolutely is. Like it's and there was a separate private pot of money where at the land bank, you know, there was a decision that said we have to lose $30,000 a house, or be prepared to lose $30,000 a house on the first 100 houses. And as that occurred, then the next 400 houses were done. And so you see all this activity in Bagley because someone said that first $3 million is infrastructure, and we need to go find someone to donate this $3 million and put that into a pot and show what can be done. You know, and you got a lot more than what we got with 7 million in Boston Edison and East English Village. But someone had to accept that cost as infrastructure to the neighborhood. So I think it's very doable, and I think it's expanding into Fitzgerald now. But you're also seeing areas like Warrendale where people are in there very much wanting to do that area and making it work on houses that probably come out to be appraised at $25,000, but they have a value to people who find $700 rents highly desirable, and that makes the numbers work over in Warrendale. And so you have people over there.
Yeah, I think your point about distinguishing appraisal from value is hugely important, so that, you know, there's value given to housing people in good quality homes.
Absolutely, thank you. And so I find that it's the least expensive way to do it.
So I know we need to move on, but I do quickly want to ask, is there a balance that we need to be hitting in Detroit between encouraging people to repair and rehab their own homes versus encouraging developers, be they large or small developers, and we can talk about that, to rehab vacant property? Obviously, I think the solution requires both, but you know, is there a balance that we need to be hitting between those two, if I can call them polarities? Perhaps it's a false dichotomy that I'm creating here, but if there is a balance, are we hitting it? Are we doing those two things in the right proportions?
I don't think we're hitting the balance because we're looking at them as a polarity, and I look at them as two completely separate things. Okay. One is how do you incentivize investment, right? There, you know, whether it's a oil company or electric company, you know, when cable came to be, or, you know, or our cell phones, someone went in and said, for there to be cell phone companies, we need to put up some towers. We need to lay some cable, and governments all over the country made investments and then brought those businesses in and absorbed those costs. So I look at that as the investment part of it. Whereas the how do we help people keep their homes repaired and up is far less of a business decision, because unless the home is truly dilapidated, then their appraisal or even its value to them is going to move a lot less. And so now we have to talk about how do we facilitate that and look at that as potentially a cost until we can get people's incomes up enough that it all folds in to their, because people may have bought houses before the housing drop, and so they have this $100,000 mortgage that they've been sitting on in a neighborhood that's where the appraisals are at 30,000, and they're like, okay, so I got to put $10,000 into this house, and it's not going to move the needle. So that becomes something that says, I think of it almost more like a a human services.
Yeah, I was just gonna say like a public health almost.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the only connection might be that in the list of community benefits that we talk to people about providing, that human services portion be one of them. And you look at, and I'll hear developers talk about that. That says, you know, what if I went down the block and fixed up, you know, everyone's porch? And then is that an active community benefit? But it's thought of as a giveaway because it's a human services thing.
Well, and I was just talking earlier as part of the FCA CBA, you know, they had to provide 1.8 million for, you know, housing, you know, upgrades for folks who are affected in the area. I know there's been a little difficulty on getting those funds out, but I was happy to see that as part of the project.
I want to mention something that happened a couple of years ago and wasn't able to continue because of lack of funding, but was very successful, I think, for what it did. And that was the Living Trades Academy operated by the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. They started in Jefferson Chalmers and then developed this program in the North End that helped people with skills to both repair and maintain their own homes, but also to get entry-level skills for employment and construction. And it took a tremendous amount of effort on the part of the nonprofit to raise dribs and drabs of money to pay the neighborhood participants a wage during this training program. But they did it once. And despite the fact that those people were successful in going on to getting jobs with construction companies, they took skills that they could then use for their own homes as well as for gainful employment. That project was not able to get renewed funding from the various philanthropic sources. And it would seem to me that these CBAs would do well to support programs like that, which touch on all of the points that we're making here.
Got it. Thanks, guys. Yeah, I think that's a big idea. Home repair as a human service or a public health service, right? I mean, I think if we can evangelize that perspective throughout the city, that we're off to a good start. So in the interest of time, again, I know we can probably talk about home repair for a long time, but in the interest of time, I want to move on to our next slide, where we have a couple questions focusing on session 1, which was about the zoning and approval process. Tanya, I hope your cell phone reception is good. But essentially, you know, we wanted to ask, you know, are there ways that Detroit can open up the site review process to allow public input earlier? Because I think, you know, in our conversation, and indeed today, we've even talked about, you know, community input is most effective for the community and the developer when it's early in the process. So how do we encourage it earlier?
So if you're talking about site plan review, that is a pretty technical process. So, and by the time a developer submits for site plan review, it's almost too late for community input. So the question is, how do we bring people in early to have that kind of dialogue? I've seen it go both ways. When a developer is still trying to figure out the scope, scale, mass, number of units, all those pre-development type things, and community is asking very detailed questions about what will the rent cost. And when you can't answer those questions, there's a lot of frustration because it's a lot of unmet expectations. So the city's role, it's very, very challenging because the city sometimes is the last to hear about the project if they're not buying city-owned property. If there's not a development agreement, if it's private property, we wouldn't necessarily look to the city to allow for greater public input. But I would be curious to hear from my colleagues that have done development and what their experiences are. But I know in trying to navigate that on behalf of our clients, it has to start much earlier than site plan review and the city approval process, and have an idea of what type of what type of input or outcomes the community is looking for. Um, if you're looking for specifically, you know, the size of housing units, things like that, that's very easy to
Tanya, you're beginning to break up a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as Tanya mentioned, I think we're interested in the other panelists' perspective on this. Tanya, we hope you could
but
come
a lot of times they're interested in the demographic. Just really a very difficult question to answer. Landscaping site. Okay, sorry. I'm really interested in hearing from Richard.
And I will say, just as context, one of the reasons why we wrote the word site review specifically in this question is because, you know, as D4 has researched this, we've seen examples in other cities where that site review step is like a specific moment where, you know, communities can provide input. But I very much appreciate your point that maybe that is too late, you know, that we need to figure out how to engage the community
So
earlier.
I completely agree with Tanya, right? So when you say, hey, this is how I want to change your world now that you put $100,000 into this into this architecture and you have you know, bought this land, then that type of uncertainty creates problems. And so the reason that the site review process can work with the city is because you can actually talk to them and know their standards and beforehand, so that when a developer is coming with site review, they either know everything that they are asking for variances or everything that how they comply. And so it's more of a conversation at the margins between the city and the developer about what's going on. And so if you inject in that, no, I think this is completely the wrong project, then that's just, that type of uncertainty says stay away from that area. And so whether it is a official process, which would be ideal for me, you know, and I think ideal for the neighborhood, or unofficial process, which is what Midtown Inc. ran, which is you could come to Midtown Inc. and they would say, if you do these things and develop this type of stuff block by block, you will have the overall community support. And if you do not, you will not have the overall community support. There will have been a lot of thought put into what was desired and required in that neighborhood before the developers got there. And so you know, I feel like a process can be as onerous as it wants to be, as long as it is certain. And so, you know, when I think of the historic tax credit, when I think of the brownfield, the TIF, there are so many hoops to jump through, but it's knowable. And so some developers will say, I'll never do historic tax credits. I'm not putting up with that stuff. But others will say, oh yeah, no, I learned it. And now I know beforehand when I'm going into a building, and I'll get my consultant and I'll get my attorney, and we'll decide all the parameters of achieving this process. And it's very much the historic tax credit and the brownfield and the TIF are all designed around this idea of a community benefit and incentivizing a community benefit and of preserving historic buildings or removing contamination of these things, and saying, if you do these 2,000 things, you will receive this benefit. And I think because it was set up beforehand, because it's fully knowable within some range beforehand, it makes all the difference.
I like to say, you know, developers need paths that are train tracks, not roads. Right. You know, with train tracks, you don't have a lot of, you know, cutoffs and different paths. You know, you have a path, and it really doesn't matter how long the path is. It does somewhat. I mean, you have to keep in mind that, developers are juggling chainsaws every time they take on a project. And so the longer the project takes, the longer they've got to keep everything moving, in sync. So, the overall process does matter, but, boy, if the path is known, it takes a lot of the risk out. Developers really need surety, and there is value in surety. So I've definitely seen where, if the city, if the city is having a surge in permit applications and they need to hire more people and they don't have the budget to do it, have a system where during a surge there is a charge in order to get a guaranteed path. Developers will pay it because it is, that knowing the length of time is so much more valuable than to say, yeah, it's going to be, the regular charge, but it might take me 3 months to get my permit or 6 months to get my permit. Oh, that's 3 extra months of me juggling chainsaws.
So Corey, I want to pick up on what you just said about, expedited path in some way. And that actually was the second question that we had set up for this, this topic, which was, we've seen in other cities where they will offer an expedited review or expedited permitting or something in exchange for some community benefit. Is there an opportunity to do that here in Detroit? Is there an appetite to do that here in Detroit? What do you guys think?
Well, I think I always wonder, is it a cost or is it an investment? So when I think of if you're in California, how they're, and the solar credits, you get enough sunshine, you can sell back to the grid, you can go below zero. So you can actually do the environmental and make it something that makes money over some long run. Whereas there are barriers here in Michigan that make it where it's not. So it's just strictly a cost. You would not break even on it. So if this expedited streamlined process is a cost as opposed to investment where it's actually going to have a benefit for the developer as well, I think that whole model breaks down, which is why you don't see factories covered in solar panels here in Michigan.
Well, to Corey's point earlier, time is money. And so if this expedited process means that they save, in holding costs and carrying costs and various things, then, I'm sure, Richard, you've seen developers who would be happy to just write a check, like the guy that wants to fix everybody's porch. If they can do it something easy and knowable like that, they're all for it. If it's more involved where, hey, we want you to hire these people from the neighborhood, not everybody's going to be as excited to try to deal with that.
So I agree, but it's if I'm saving $300,000 worth of holding costs, but what I get to do is spend the extra $1 million in community benefits, then I'll just wait my $300,000 in holding costs. And so
there has to be some understanding of kind of what those dollars look like. I agree.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
And then let me just say as an aside, is in terms of the sustainability stuff, talk to Consumers Power and Detroit Edison, who are preventing the regulatory regime in renewable energy from making solar profitable in Michigan.
So I'm glad you named them because that's exactly what I was getting to. You cannot sell below zero in Michigan and you can in California. That's why we see it out there.
And lots of other states, not just California. We do it in DC too.
Right. And so you see people getting into the solar panels.
Got it. Well, before we leave this slide, I did just want to ask, so we've already identified that maybe site review is too late to bring in community input, but we want to be able to provide train tracks, not roads. And so is there a way to codify or present a predictable manner in which community input can happen earlier, perhaps before site review? Like,
I believe that the best way is for the community, and it will happen as each community gets worried about people coming to their neighborhood. If a community isn't worried about someone coming to their neighborhood and changing their fabric, then the impetus may not be there. But as they are, organize before they get there, organize and get all of the community requirements before the developers even show up. And it's the strongest document for the community, and it's the best document for the developer. If you want to be on this block, you need to be doing this type of thing. This is where we want to see our rents. And if no developers show up, then the community may say, "Did we make our request a little too onerous? Maybe we should lighten up. Maybe we should have some conversation with developers." But having that defined, the more definition, the better. So I can look and say, this is the community where, you know, these are all the things I want to do, and more than happy to come in and do them. Or, hey, I think I may need to talk to them about a couple of things. But that definition is just huge. And I think it's huge for the community as well, because having the argument back and forth amongst the community members while the developer is trying to decide and they're in the room is also a negative for the community, because then the developer gravitates towards the ones who agree with them and they try to outnumber the ones who don't agree. And it becomes this whole division thing. Having those arguments, getting them all set beforehand is huge.
Yeah, and I would just like to jump in, Sam, really quick. With the brownfield process, I've seen a few examples, particularly from developers who are not familiar with the area, nor the communities, begin this engagement process really, really late in the game. And it often backfires. So, I mean, I think there needs to be a really big emphasis on speaking with the community and getting with the community as soon as you're thinking about doing something. Waiting till last minute can just, it just backfires, and I've seen it happen several times.
I think it also shows that there's a need to understand the differences between neighborhoods. You know, real estate development is not widgets, even though it's unfortunately often treated that way. It is extremely place specific. And without real local knowledge, people are going to make mistakes, because it's never going to be the exact same thing in every part of the city or in every city in the state. In response to my earlier observation about, you know, where to get oriented to who are the organizations in a neighborhood, David Palmer posted in the chat a link to the CDAD tool that attempts to do a lot of that. And it is the kind of thing that you can use, but need to know what you're looking at. It will be hard to just drop in from somewhere else, not knowing, is the Algonquin Block Club super active? Like, do they really, you know, how much of the neighborhood do they represent? What are the politics there? You know, there's no substitute for local knowledge, and having a team that is sensitive to that and can make connections is going to be essential, no matter how much data you have.
Yeah.
I'd like to just add that predictability goes both ways. I mean, the developers need a process that's predictable. They can estimate the timelines, but when the residents or the community groups also know, have some expectations about how many hearings, you know, is this my only chance for input? A lot of projects, they'll come through for rezoning, they'll come land sale, they might need a variance.
Tanya, you broke up for a moment.
Tax incentives, and so there's all these opportunities for formal public input. The process, they think that it's a process and it's not one and done, and so I think that's important. Time is money, and can you hear me now, Sam?
Yeah. Yep. You're back.
Did I break up?
You did, but that's okay. I think we can.
Yeah, I felt like the gist of it was
Yeah,
there.
we got the gist.
And it's a very important thing in terms of the community saying, okay, we got to rally today to go fight this developer. We got to rally today to go work with that one, versus having some structure beforehand.
I was just saying that in terms of streamlining and expediting, that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we can move on to the next slide. And so for our audience, this is our last slide before we're going to open it up to just general Q&A. So our third session, we talked a lot about developer incentives. And I'm actually going to throw up both questions. So Francis, can we throw up both questions at the same time? Thank you. Because I think they're related, right? I mean, essentially the questions are there, creative ways we should be using financing incentives to just encourage, more equitable development and better community outcomes? Like, are there incentives that we aren't utilizing enough? Is there an opportunity to create new incentives, opportunity or need? And then, all of this is wrapped up in evaluation, right? So, are there metrics that we can or should be using to make sure that these incentives are having the type of community outcomes that we're looking for?
So what I want to really kind of push forward as an idea is that each incentive that we know of was actually an activist community is setting something to guide towards a desired benefit. So the historic tax credit was an activist community saying we have to preserve these buildings. The brownfield was an environmentalist community saying we have to clean up these lots. We have to get rid of this contamination, and we have to incentivize. And each of those were structured, and as people achieve that, they get the incentive strictly for achieving that specific community benefit that was defined beforehand. Where we're running into problems is coming in and saying, on top of that defined community benefit that someone already structured and set up, I want you to add this additional community benefit to get that original community benefit. and so by just adding on without incorporating it truly in, then you're just diluting a benefit and saying, okay, this will be less rewarding. We're just reducing the incentive, which reduces the behavior. Each desired outcome, whatever it is, hiring Detroiters, lower rents, should be structured as its own financial incentive that says there are economics behind this and some thought behind this, and this is the exact structure to do this. If you want the hiring Detroiters tax credit, you got to hire Detroiters. And so not if you want the federal historic tax credit, you have to hire Detroiters, because now you just made it where it's less incentivized in Detroit to work in Detroit than it would be to work anyplace else, because you're jumping on someone else's activist incentive. And so creating this model and working out the economics, it tends to be the key. And that's why those things have seemed so successful. It's and there are adjustments in them. And so I really want to think in terms of, yeah, absolutely, you can create financial incentives to accomplish things people want to see in the neighborhood. It's how all the incentives came to be, but you have to do the whole process.
Well, and I would like to jump in and say that, I mean, like a brownfield TIF and an abatement for that matter, we have some great projects that are in neighborhoods, but if you're looking at smaller scale development, there might be the capacity there to actually go through a process to have a brownfield plan approved or have an abatement approved. So I think there needs to be some sort of funding, and we've been thinking about this with the brownfield because we're shoring up our local brownfield revolving fund. ways where, you know, we can provide grant funding to Detroit headquartered businesses for things like phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessments, which have to be done on the outset, and smaller CDCs just may not have that capital. So I think in thinking of this, we also have to think about the access to being able to get those incentives approved in the first place.
And I just want to speak to Richard's earlier point about kind of thinking of things as infrastructure that wouldn't typically be thought of that way. You know, and also recognizing that we're not the first people to have these conversations. These have been the subject of people's, you know, hard work for decades. And if you think about, you know, tax increment financing was another tool that was designed specifically for this kind of purpose, as a way to help, you know, pay for things that wouldn't otherwise get done. I just want to put a plug in for what I think of as a very successful community outreach and planning effort that is attempting now to really connect a lot of dots around the development, you know, the development issues. And that is the Joe Louis Greenway and the next phase of that project, which is being undertaken on the west side. And, you know, from reading about it, it appears that they did a tremendous outreach effort to find out what people wanted to see and how to choose which segment to build up next. And I think that it's an interesting example of an infrastructure piece, because the Greenway is a new piece of infrastructure that is going to really change people's lives who live along it, as well as people who will come to it from somewhere else, and then create development opportunities around it. And so I think one of their efforts now is to figure out how all of the existing incentives that may be applicable to the area around the Greenway can be harnessed to achieve the kinds of outcomes that they want. And it seems to me that that's a really good example of a place and a project that can address a lot of the things that we're talking about here.
And, you know, one of the things, going back to what Richard said, of how these incentives were all pushed by a specific desire. And so one of the things that I've noticed, I do a lot of work in Ohio versus Michigan, is that Michigan has 5 different tax abatement programs. And each program had a specific purpose, and it's been added to over the years, but it has some glaring you know, just differences. So like new construction residential for rent, there actually is no tax abatement for, unless you're on a commercial corridor.
Yeah.
And so we have these odd, like, we want new construction residential rental, but there's no way of abating that property tax. Whereas Ohio has one tax abatement program that covers basically everything. And quite frankly, when you look at Michigan's 5, they either freeze the property tax at its current level, so you don't get the increase, or in the case of new construction, it modifies the rate. So rather than paying the full, say, 86 mills in Detroit, you would pay 20 mills in Detroit. But they each follow basically one of those 2 paths, but you have to figure out which path your project fits in. And frankly, if you're a new developer, you probably need a consultant to help you, and that consultant costs money, you know. And so it then again it excludes a certain, you know, it excludes new developers coming in, or smaller developers that can't afford that. We also have 5 different TIF programs in this state. Ohio has 2, you know, and quite frankly, one of them is used 90% of the time. The other one is hardly ever used. So, you know, it is frankly so much simpler to describe, you know, and to know the process and, you know, everything. So, you know, I can do brownfield remediation under the same TIF program that I'm doing public infrastructure, you know, and so it's just a hell of a lot simpler, and we could make it simpler in our state. We just haven't done it.
That's a really interesting point, Corey, that like if we could simplify it, we could actually be using these incentives to create the type of community outcomes that we're looking for to a greater degree.
No, it's a big deal. It's, you know, you can add new doors on to the same incentive as opposed to creating a whole new incentive.
And a lot of our TIF programs, just really quick, were recodified into one act. So, you know, DDA, the Local Development Finance Authority, Corridor Improvement Authority, it's now PA 57 of 2018. However, there's a different section. There's a different section for each one and what you can do and how it qualifies. And it's just like, you know, it should just be all, I think it should just be combined under one umbrella.
Yeah. And, you know, as you guys can imagine, I mean, if it is a challenge for you professionals and experts to navigate, it is especially difficult for community residents to understand and figure out how to like weigh in where needed. So, yeah. Well, speaking of community weighing in, I want to turn it over to audience questions and answers. So if you're joining us in the audience, please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand in the participant box. But I will start off with a question that was actually emailed to me from a D4 board member last night. So, you know, board member prerogatives. But it actually is on the topic of incentives, which why it's the first one. So the question is, are there any comprehensive reviews of incentives that were put forth in the past, right? So like, are we looking at an abatement or incentive that was granted 10, 20 years ago and looking at the subsequent economic, fiscal, or social impact?
So I can speak for the Brownfield TIF Act 381 of 1996. In 2013, they implemented this very, I think I referred to it before. It's a reporting, an annual reporting on the tax increment revenue that we receive for each project. But we also have to report on metrics. So for every brownfield plan that's been approved since 2013, the metrics are obviously a lot more robust than previous brownfield plans where, you know, I tried to get that information from, but, you know, they're in boxes down in basements and other buildings. So to me, that is a way that they're reviewing the effectiveness of the brownfield program. I also have to submit that report to City Council. As the years go on, it will become more robust, but it does things like reports, you know, jobs, Detroit residency, construction, percentages on jobs, investments. So, you know, it's a way to track, and it's the way for the Michigan legislature in order to extend the Brownfield Act so they can monitor the effectiveness of the program. So that's one way where they're doing that.
Got it. Great. Any questions from the audience? I know we have some people that aren't shy, so please feel free to jump in, guys. While they're thinking of questions, I'll throw out one quickly. And this one is probably for you, Corey. So I know you've talked a lot about the Community Reinvestment Act. Can you remind us, like, why is that important and what should we be doing about it?
Sure. So the Community Reinvestment Act was passed in the early 70s as anti-redlining legislation. Basically, in a nutshell, what it says is that regulated financial institutions, primarily banks, have to make loans and investments where they take deposits. They can't just, take money from an area, say, primarily African-American area, and then never make a loan or never make an investment in that area, which is largely what was happening, through redlining. Yeah, they would take your money, they would take your deposit, but you'd never get a loan. So the legislation was updated through rulemaking in the mid 90s, but it really hasn't been changed since that time. But banking has quite a bit. So one of the things that we have now is bankless branches, right? Bankless banking. So, for example, I can open up a savings account now with Discover Bank. So we all think of Discover as being a credit card, but they were an East Coast bank. They created the credit card, became national, but they don't have branches, for example, in Michigan at all. And the old CRA was basically based on branches because that's how you did banking, right? In the early 90s, I would not open up a savings account in a bank in Alabama where I had to drive down there or mail in my deposits, right? It just didn't make a lot of sense. So the legislation needs to be updated to account for branchless banking. But unfortunately, what the current administration has done is they have taken this opportunity to update the CRA in a couple of very fundamental ways. One is right now, there's not a specified level that banks have to achieve. Banks actually compete with one another in terms of whether they're investing enough. And so now this new rule would basically set a limit or set a minimum that banks have to achieve based on their asset size. Well, what happens when you set a minimum? They're only going to achieve that minimum. So I think one of the things that's going to happen is that levels are going to drop in terms of bank investment. The other thing is that banks can basically invest anywhere that they operate. And so I think there's going to be, as Ross Perot put it, a great sucking sound as investment goes to stronger areas. So if I'm a bank and I can invest in a qualified census tract in Brooklyn versus a qualified census tract in Flint, doesn't matter how, yes, that could be a rough census tract, but New York City is New York City. It's a stronger market than Flint, Michigan. And so even if I'm not operating, and here's what really kind of drives me crazy, even if I'm not operating in Brooklyn, I can make that investment and have that count for my CRA. So there's been a number of changes. There's some great white papers that the National Community Resource Coalition has put out, NCRC, that I encourage you to take a look at. And we really need the new administration to, unfortunately, the Trump administration actually got this rule published. And so now we're going to have to go through a whole new rule-making process to get it undone. And there's a reason why these things only get looked at every 20 to 30 years, because federal rulemaking is a long process. So watch out for public comment. We're definitely going to need everyone's help in making sure that we get these changes reversed. So, and unfortunately with that, I've got to bounce because I'm actually teaching a class on affordable housing finance in 5 minutes. So good to see everyone. I really hope that D4 continues this conversation. It's been great. Thank you so much, Francis and Sam, for leading this, and let's keep it going.
Great. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you.
I'm glad we were able to get that CRA question in before Corey had to leave. Yeah.
Hey, Sam, could I just address a point that Corey raised in the CRA? As he mentioned, the law itself goes back to 1977, but it didn't have any teeth until the savings and loan crisis in '89. And it was that law that came out of that SNL crisis called FIREA that gave the rating system to CRA that really caused banks, meaning regulated depositories. So that's when you go to the bank and you see, FDIC. So if they were a financial institution that was regulated by the OCC, the FDIC, that's the kind of financial institution that was governed and is governed by CRA. And starting in the early 90s, banks were busy merging. Remember when all the banks started consolidating and the brands went away and changed? In order to get those mergers approved, CRA ratings became incredibly important. And that's when organizations like NCRC that Corey mentioned came into being in order to pressure banks to do better and to help improve what they were doing in terms of loans and investments in low-income communities. So as Corey mentioned, we're now in a world where there are branchless banks. People are doing things online, but not only that, think about your mortgage lending and the rise of the United Shores and the Quickens of the world, who are now the largest mortgage lenders. They're not subject to CRA. So I think a real big policy question, which I suspect is addressed in some of those papers Corey was mentioning, is what is the appropriate scope of CRA, and will it be extended to financial institutions and financial services players beyond the regulated depositories?
Interesting. Yeah. Thanks for that, David. And I'll call on David Palmer, who has his hand raised.
CRA conversation is wicked interesting. I've been on the Federal Reserve Board's community feedback panel for the last 5 years here in Detroit at the Chicago branch, and the sort of roundtable discussion with the bankers touting all the wonderful things that they've done versus the fact that they have no uniform reporting requirements and can't show positive outcomes in the community outside of anecdote is pretty telling. So I think at least the Detroit branch of the Federal Reserve is open to potential conversations about rulemaking feedback. Whether or not that is quick or possible within the political environment is obviously a whole set of different questions. But they realize that regulating fintech and the Quicken Loans and UWAs of the world is outside purview. And does an ATM count as having a physical location or not? These sorts of things are open. But the piece that I wanted to ask about is I was on a feedback forum for CDAM last night. I know Sam has provided some feedback to CDAM over the years, and they seem to be kind of on a fishing expedition to try to figure out where their policy priorities and objectives should be. So I was curious from the D4 team's piece is there a way that we could potentially leverage a better position on the policy platform that CDAM has to push for the types of reforms that have been discussed this morning, whether it's the crazy buffet of regulations and options for financing, or the fact that we can't do truly affordable housing in most of the state. And there was a lot of discussion yesterday about rural affordable housing challenges and HUD terms expiring for multifamily units in rural communities, which are all going market rate now. So what can we do to better leverage state power through this network?
Yeah, that's a great question, David, because, much of D4's work concentrates at the local level, right? I mean, we get very involved in local policy, but many of the things that we talk about touch on state policy. So,
yeah, it's all preempted before we even come up with an innovation.
Right.
So, if it all goes back to the amateurs running the show in Lansing, who have no institutional memory and little appreciation for the urban and rural challenges are really the same, but with different scaling challenges, then it seems like there's a storytelling opportunity here.
Totally agree. So yeah, I mean, like Richard, David, Jennifer, Tanya, what do you guys think? I mean, are there state reforms that have been on your radar that we should be thinking about more? I mean, if we're talking about simplifying abatements, right? I imagine that has to happen in Lansing. What do you guys think?
So I think in terms of because so many things that we use, are state funded. It when you see things move, you tend to have a group who's done exactly what David spoke about, gone out and connected with different communities. Because if you just go with, hey, this is good for Detroit, that doesn't get anyone at the state level excited. And so you have to say, this is good for Detroit and Saginaw and Coldwater. And, all of these places would benefit from this based upon these different things. And so you have to patch together a network to get through sufficient number of legislatures to get something done. So, you see the people doing the state historic tax credit, they don't just want the big Detroit projects. They want to show how, if you go up into UP, the main streets are historic buildings, and it's very important. And if you go into, the smaller towns, you still have all these historic buildings, and what's necessary for Capitol Park is also necessary for a Main Street program, and tie all that together. And so it's, I think the one that I'm very focused on now is some type of overall property tax reform. How do we make something that, instead of going with broad abatements and kind of figuring out, do they patch together, saying, how do we fix the property tax system, certainly in Detroit, but how does that provide some benefit to every other community and their own individual property tax problems? And so that we're able to go very clearly and patch together this network of saying, this works, this provides a benefit to all these other places.
So Richard, I've heard you talk about property tax before, but I don't think we've done so in this session. Can you give me the quick highlights, the Cliff's Notes on what's wrong with our current property tax regime?
So I think of Detroit's property tax regime as not designed to actually collect property tax, because it doesn't contribute a bunch to the budget. It's designed as a gate into development. You have to get an abatement for development, generally to be viable. Certainly multifamily and most non-vice oriented commercial development. Certainly you can pay your full taxes if you open up, a liquor store. But if you want to have, some community space or retail or something along those lines, you're going to need a tax abatement. So it's not really to collect those taxes. It's actually to drive people to the table to see, to go through this process of approval. One of the problems is that tax abatements they burn off. And so you go back to, you actually in a race from the second you get a tax abatement to get your rents high up enough to offset the additional taxes when this abatement goes away. Yeah. And so you can't maintain low rents. You have to get them up, because this regular 88 mills tax is coming somewhere between 10 and 15 years from now. And you have to have enough money to actually pay that when it comes. And so, it creates a need for upward pressure that doesn't have to be there otherwise. And so, and it just drives this contention of, this is the way to achieve a long list of uncertain requirements by attaching it to the tax abatements that doesn't incentivize development. So getting to something that says, what is the real reasonable collectible rate? And how do we spread that broadly? Because a developer can jump through all the hoops for the abatement, but there's not a good abatement process at all for single family or small multifamily rental homes. And so where we need it the most, there's nothing out there. Trying to tell someone how they could go get, a abatement for a two family is, it would just be nuts for them to even go through that process. And so, or attempt to, or for DGC to spend, 6 months trying to get someone to get through it. And so it's, so having something that actually works and putting the separate requirements separate, as opposed to trying to piggyback them on an actual economic viability, then it provides for a clearer path to actually get things done, and you just make the requirements like the zoning, you know, is not attached to some incentive. It says this shall be what you will do in this area, and if you want a variance, you have to come to this board. And any other requirement, any other community benefit should be done the same way, that doesn't attach it to life or death liability.
And I think that's a really interesting point you made about how the abatements burn off, and that actually inhibits long-term affordability in our city.
I was on a call with a homeowners association, and their NEZs are about to expire. So, you know, the question is, what do we do now? And we don't really have an answer for that. So I agree with Richard wholeheartedly on this.
Got it.
Well, can't you re-up in some cases your NEC?
We're looking into the feasibility of that, but it's not as clear cut as we would like it to be.
It seems very band-aid-ish, and it's going to raise some real questions as opposed to truly fixing it. But whenever you sell, then you get this huge jump in value, and people can get hit with these 88 meals or whatever it is, 60 when his home prices are. But it's always this thing out there looming, trying to achieve some set benefit as opposed to just being a money raiser for funding infrastructure and having the requirements separate.
Got it. I want to put Voss Jacobs on the spot if I can. Sorry, Voss. But earlier in the conversation, you know, we talked a lot about how one of the most effective ways for communities to engage developers is before the development even starts, right? And so we talked a lot about neighborhood plans and how that's an effective tool. Voss, you have experience with the West Village Neighborhood Association, and you know, who put together that type of vision. Would you mind just telling us, you know, like, how did that go? Has it been effective? And yeah, if there's any questions for the panelists, you know, like let's
No, thanks, Sam. Thank you to the panelists for putting this together. A lot of great information running through this conversation. Just an abundance of information. So I look forward to watching the sessions at a later date. But yeah, the community association, you know, I echo a lot of what people said about developers coming earlier to the association. We have, you know, Cliff Brown, that probably everyone knows, working on another project here in West Village, and he learned from his first building here, the project, you know, partnering with Invest Detroit, that you come, you know, like roughly a week before the historic district commission makes a decision, then it's a scramble, and people are upset, and people aren't going to be satisfied with just the pizza at the meeting. They're going to be really, you know, upset. So that's what occurred. You know, we were a little frustrated that the historic district doesn't describe why they made their decision. Having said that, I wasn't opposed to the project, but you know, that's a whole other subject. But the point being is that the second time around, Cliff came. He's come early to stakeholders in the neighborhood to kind of discuss, you know, his flexibility around the project and what people want, things like that. We have provided the community values statement, and you know, it's 3 to 4 pages, and I think we erred on making it that long. I think there's a lot of different community interests, and we wanted to take everybody's ideas and put them together, and that kind of ends up being a huge document. Now, maybe a developer likes that because they can pick and choose areas to maybe tweak their development, but from our end, it might be a little too long and cumbersome to communicate effectively, but it does provide some things that we want. Now, you know, our outreach in the neighborhood has to be re-up now because it's starting to age and the neighborhood changes, right? So you have to keep those community values fresh. But yes, Cliff on his second development is coming here early, and you know, he's a great guy, and he's looking for ways to make sure that the project melds with what residents want, you know, should they want certain things. So, and I echo what people said about the developer paying a little bit of money for outreach, because what happens in the neighborhood is we have to put the volunteer hours towards getting the word out to everybody and flyering and putting the doors up. So a really modest amount of $100, $200 makes a big difference on outreach. So yeah, I echo those subjects that came up, and I appreciate the discussion on it. You know, I do, my question was the one, that you fielded, Jennifer, on the analysis around the brownfield TIF credit. And just generally speaking, I feel like there needs to be more analysis on incentives, whether through the DEGC or the Michigan, the equivalent at the Michigan state level. You know, we have incentives now 20 years old, so you can really look at what does happen when that tax incentive wears off, like Richard was just talking about. Is there another incentive granted, or is that property sold? Like David mentioned, he's selling his house because his taxes are going up, or is that business thriving? So I do think we need some more reports on that, so we can really talk and see the impact. So anyway, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Boz. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there, and especially like how are we resourcing, how are we preparing community groups to be, you know, doing that type of visioning and planning, especially because that's really important. Someone sent me a private message that basically was asking about, like, just in general, they feel like community groups need more education around development incentives and financing and things like that. And that obviously is, you know, one of the reasons why we're doing these sessions here. And Jennifer, I know that you will talk to anybody who will listen to try and, you know, present that background. But, you know, maybe a broad question is, like, if we're not doing enough about that education, how do we do more? Is it a million little things? Is it one big thing?
I think, you know, I think there's more that needs to be done. And I brought this up earlier. I think that explaining and making sure that the citizens of the city are aware of exactly how these incentives work. What is a tax abatement? What is a TIF? You know, what are the different kinds of TIF is very important. You know, I've participated in a few events. Occasionally I'll show up to a CBO meeting to explain how TIF works. But I know we're discussing holding meetings in, you know, the different respective council areas to be able to hold public meetings to explain how this works. So it's just a matter of planning it in the era of COVID.
So I would love for the education to be about empowering the community to do it for themselves, far more than kind of weaponizing how to attack a developer.
Exactly. Well, yeah, most definitely. I mean, I would approach it with, like, you can use this too. This isn't just for, you know, Dan Gilbert. This is for, you know, any, you know, you can use it for a small project as well.
Right. I think you would get broader buy-in that says, hey, you know, this scales up and it scales down. You can actually put these things into place, and you get a broader group of people learning. When you say, hey, look, let me explain to you, you know, how, you know, whether it's false information about, you know, stealing money from the schools, or whether it's accurate, this whole we're learning so we can fight that. I haven't seen that even be effective, and it doesn't draw the broadest group of people. And so, you know, I want them to understand so that they can get in there and say, hey, wait a minute, abatements don't work for a two-family? Well, that's unacceptable. Let's fix that. Let's get in there and so that we can fix our neighborhood and feel empowered and have that broader reach. I think that having the education piece go that way
I agree with you. I think that's a good way to approach it.
I feel like the strongest public comment a community group could ever have on anyone's approval for anything is, we laid out exactly what this neighborhood was requiring and desiring up front. It was on a website. This person ignored it, and what they are presenting is complete opposition. It wasn't, this is what we were trying to get from this developer. This is what this neighborhood is requiring, has been required before they even bought the land and before they even got to this area. and they are pushing against it. And I think everyone from other developers, the city council to DGC would hear that loudly and clearly. We established what this neighborhood wants, and this person is violated. So it wouldn't have to be, I don't like this guy, or he didn't talk to us enough, or any of this type of stuff, you know, that can get pushback. If something is clear before you get there, it is much, much harder to say you didn't know, or there's some special purpose. And so that pre-organization strengthens the community.
Yeah. You know, it seems to me we're getting into some like big, broad thoughts here. So perhaps this is a good time to, perhaps this is a good segue to, you know, some of our closing thoughts. We, you know, in the final, you know, 10 to 15 minutes or so, I wanted to give all of the speakers just an opportunity to, you know, provide a closing comment. So, you know, we've now had these conversations. What are you left feeling? What in your minds, you know, what can we be doing to further equitable development, however you define it, right? Are there policies in place that we need to be pursuing? Is it just more conversations like this? What do you guys think?
I mean, I jotted down some thoughts if you want to hear them. I'm ready to address it. I think there are a lot that, you know, there are many policies that, you know, we can be doing for more equitable development, but I landed on three really important ones for me. The first being creating more inclusive housing. You know, 20% at 80% AMI is a start, but I don't think you know, we could certainly go deeper. So seeing the Detroit Housing for the Future Fund, you know, which allows, you know, funding for 60, you know, at or under 60% AMI is a good start, because I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, we need affordable housing. It's another thing to make it pencil for the developer. So having that fund, to me, is a good start with that. I also think that developments, you know, that have significant, you know, jobs available, seeing that Detroiters have first, you know, like with FCA, they were allowed to apply first. There's a big emphasis on making sure that Detroiters got those jobs is important. When we're talking about large job generators. And then lastly, I think there needs to be a real big emphasis on small businesses. You know, not only do they create many jobs, but they also stabilize neighborhoods. So like seeing the Motor City Match program, whereby they helped business owners maybe even just go from home to brick and mortar, is a good program, I think. You know, in addition to that, streetscape improvements, you know, along those business corridors. So what happened at Livernois and 6 and 7 Mile, although that impacted some businesses, not in a good way, because they saw a decrease in traffic. So then again, having those you know, grant funds available to help offset the loss in business, you know, was crucial as well. And then, you know, I can't not cover COVID. So, you know, all the small businesses and the effects they're feeling with COVID, and the grant funding that is going out to assist those businesses as well. So, you know, for me right now, it's, you know, making sure that we have inclusive housing, you know, making sure that Detroiters have jobs, and making sure that we support our small businesses.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah. Richard, Tanya, David, what do you guys think?
So,
Oh,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Richard.
No, go ahead. I've been doing a ton of talking.
All right. I had some closing thoughts about how community groups could get more involved and improve community engagement. And a lot of these thoughts and examples come from our work with Midtown Detroit Inc. We've worked very closely with them for the last 5 years. One of the things is the city should partner more closely with organizations when they're writing and issuing RFPs, and when they're selecting developers who respond to those RFPs. I know Sue has been involved in nearly every RFP that has gone out in areas that she touches. I know the Eastern Market Partnership is spoken into RFPs there, but it's really hit or miss. It's not a formalized process. And so there's certainly something that I think can be formalized. Secondly, being proactive in things like rezonings and neighborhood planning processes. The neighborhood plans, I think Planning and Development has done a great job in engaging community groups. Some areas better than others, but very few people realize that anyone can request a rezoning. And a few years ago, we in Midtown rezoned most of the Midtown area to SD1 and SD2 in order to encourage mixed-use development. That was initiated by the nonprofit community organization, not by a developer available. And then lastly, I would say one thing that I don't think people realize they can do to be proactive is just monitor real estate transactions in the area in the same way that developers, when they're acquiring property, are reaching out to see who owns this. Community organizations can monitor who's buying property in their area and reach out to them and say, hey, I'm a resource, I'm available, love to work with you, and provide input. Again, I know in Midtown, Sue very rarely does a piece of property switch hands in Midtown before Sue's trying to figure out who bought it, why they bought it, and what they're going to do with it. And so, again, it goes back to what Corey said earlier. You know, all of this takes a lot of funding, and most of our community organizations do not have full-time staff. However, those are just some ideas that I had that might push the needle a little further towards just inclusive and full engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. Those are great thoughts. I totally agree with you about the RFPs. So, I mean, I think I would even love to talk to you offline about how we can get, how communities can help inform RFPs, because I think that's critically important. Yeah, and then, you know, a quick question. I know we're in the closing thoughts, but I can't let this one go. You know, as someone who tries to help communities monitor development, because you're right, I mean, they should be, you know, staying on top of like what development is happening and who's buying property. Other than like, you know, the newspaper, are there resources you would suggest communities look at as they try to stay on top of who's buying property or what developments are happening in their neighborhood?
So I think in any community, there's key parcels, development parcels. In my presentation, I used the case study of the Arnold Homes site. That is, you know, has been vacant for a long time, screaming for development, and was bought by a private developer. That would be an example of a parcel that the community who wanted further engagement would have been monitoring when that was sold. Luckily, great developer purchased it and engaged the community right away. However, that if it wasn't the case, we'd want to make sure as the community organization we're aware that that has been purchased. So I think it's just monitoring, you know, the open data portals or the assessors list the owners, and it's the same way when we're trying to reach out to property owners. We're sending certified letters to the owner of record. I don't know, Richard, you probably have better, more sophisticated ways of monitoring transactions, but that's one thing that comes to mind.
No, I think your methods are you know, kind of what's available. It's a journalist though shocked me once by telling me that one of their ways of monitoring was checking on new LLC formations, because we'll often use like the building name or the address in the LLC. and so they'll say, oh, 609 East Kirby LLC has been formed. Seems like someone's interested in that project. And so, that may be another way, kind of, if there's a, kind of group of things, if I don't know if they're just looking through them all or looking through what's been formed in Detroit or how that works. But that was a new and shocking one I hadn't heard of.
It's a good tip. Yeah, David or Richard, any closing thoughts?
So I think, sorry,
Go ahead.
So my quick closing thought, and I sometimes people will think I'm trying to be snarky, but I'm really not when I say do a project. The community groups should do even the smallest project, because it is so informative. It's this driver of learning and understanding, but it's not just so that you become pro-development. It's actually, when I did my first project, it made me feel like I had all the evidence in the world that it is not the knowledge base of Detroit contractors that keeps them out of deals. It's structural barriers, and that they have all the knowledge, regardless of what anyone says, to do it, because I have a physical project done mostly by Detroit contractors. I just had to remove their structural barriers. And so, and when you do a project and some developer says this can't be done, and you say, that's weird because I already did it, then it's such a stronger argument to say that you can scale what's already been done than to just take stabs and tell a developer what can be done without that evidence. And obviously there's going to be some chicken and egg where you may have to do that in the meantime, but doing a project is a huge contributor towards the knowledge base and the strength of an argument. And it's, I think Midtown Inc.'s Ferry Inn is a good example where she always knew what could be done and what couldn't be done and what were the real struggles. And that informed her ability to harness and control developers coming into her area.
Notably, my very first historic tax credit project in 1999 was the Inn on Ferry Street.
yeah, right.
So there were three things that I wrote down, and one of them is something we really haven't discussed, and that is, what does a mixed income neighborhood look like? If you think about, equitable development and what that term means to people and why we're trying to address the issue of community engagement in the development process, some of it, I think, is that neighbors who are longtime residents are fearful of being displaced. And they see that new development as something that will prevent them from remaining in their homes or prevent them from financially benefiting from a rise in property values, and that they'll get pushed out. And I think that there needs to be more discussion and really kind of a visioning exercise around, what do people want to see? What kind of neighborhood do they want to live in? And what does it mean for people of different means to live on the same block or in the same neighborhood? And I think a lot more needs to be done to explore that question, because I think it will also drive the nature of community engagement around the development process. A second point is more of a specific reminder that if those who were on the third session will recall that the state historic tax credit in Michigan has been absent now from the last governor's administration, and is on the cusp of being reinstated. So at the state Senate, it's been in process, and we encourage you to contact your legislators and see that it comes back, because more projects will happen in neighborhoods if we have a state historic tax credit. It's that simple. And then the last one was a question about the pandemic, really. As the stimulus wore off and people are facing eviction or foreclosure, the moratoriums are also ending. And so I don't have a sense for the extent of that crisis in the city, but I'm fearful that we're going to start seeing foreclosures and evictions. And what are people going to do about that?
I think it's such a big problem that people put their heads in the sand and hoping that it'll work its way out. But I've been very worried about it. And someone has to do something because, you know, I mean, people were getting behind even when there was that $600 a week that went away almost 3 months ago. And there has to be something some rational understanding of how to set this right. When I look at a city like Houston saying, hey, we got $50 million and that going in 45 minutes or whatever it was, is, you know, it shows the scale of this problem. And so it's a big number, but ignoring it will not help at all.
Yeah. Yes. Super. Very helpful. Unfortunately, guys, that is all the time we have. It's 11 o'clock. How time flies when you're talking about equitable development, right? So I just want to, you know, just give one final thanks to everyone who joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, whether today was your first session or whether you've been with us for all four. I also want to thank all of the presenters, you know, David, Richard, Jennifer, Tanya, Corey, who is, you know, with us at this particular moment. But just thank you guys. We really appreciate it. And we hope to keep the conversation going in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, so as a reminder, we will be putting these videos up on the web. I think today's was fascinating. I know my mind is spinning with like new ideas, and most of them inspirational. Some of them are distressing, like the foreclosures, you know, things to watch out for. But this is all really good stuff. So thank you again, and we hope to catch up with you soon.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Great presentation.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great holiday.